Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
We're happy to have you for Bible class on this wonderful Sunday morning, getting away a little bit from the crazy week of school starting and hurricanes and crazy week for a crazy year, Jacob.
It is. Just a lot of firsts
Yeah.
that's happened. And they all seem to be happening all together. But
Yep.
we're making it through.
Hey, but when it rains, it rains,
Yeah,
right?
it does. I
feel like we need to work in a salt and light conversation.
Yeah,
with
probably so, but we're not going to.
Morton
so.
Salt. No, we're not, because we're going to be in James chapter 1.
Yeah, we're still in 1.
Still in 1. As we were preparing for this class, Jacob made the comment this morning, actually, that the way we're teaching the class is really the way James should have been divided.
Yeah, I don't know who decided to put the chapters where in James, but I don't think they knew what they were doing.
No.
Maybe they did well on some other places, but I think that they kind of missed the boat.
Should have consulted
James.
us.
Yeah.
I would argue probably also the way they divided John 7 and 8. There's a little bit left. There's that one, John 7:53 is just kind of hanging there.
That's true. Good point.
So James chapter 1, by way of quick review, James chapter 1, we talked about when we got into this study how James is a very practical application of the Word, which is what I like about it. Jacob knows, those of you who know me, I'm big on practicality.
You are.
And that's exactly what it is. And James really tries our thinking on what it actually means to be a Christian in practice.
Yeah.
He starts out, he talks about our need to ask for wisdom. He talks about what it's like when we fall into trials and how we deal with those things.
Last week, the reason that's so important to look at is this is how James always is, kind of direct to the point. When we looked at Acts 15, you saw a lot of the debate going on, and then it was finally like James said, okay, I'm going to speak. He spoke his words of saying what needed to happen, and that's what happened. He just cut through all the debate, got to the point, and said, I've looked at all this, I've heard all this, this is what it comes down to.
Yep. He's that guy you need in every meeting who can just summarize the points and get things moving.
Right.
So for this morning, we're going to be in chapter 1. We're going to pick up where we left off, which was in verse 19 from last week. So I'd encourage you, if you missed last week's class, it's still out there on YouTube. Go look it up and get your backstory up to this point. But James 1 and verse 19 says, "This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God." We're going to stop there just for a minute and just handle those two verses alone before we keep moving through.
It's almost like we planned this, right?
Almost as if. I was about to say, it's almost as if we talked to Steve. If you saw the slides going by just before class started, our Wednesday night series brought to us by Steve is Words with Friends. This past week, we had the pleasure of talking about angry words. Mm-hmm. This next week, I believe the lesson is entitled The Send Button.
Yeah.
I wonder what that might be about.
Yeah, that one should be fun. Hopefully everybody will listen to it. There may be some toes stepped on next week.
Maybe, mine included.
Yes.
But these two verses hit directly on what it is that we're talking about in Steve's lessons. The anger, verse 20, the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. So it begs the question, what does the anger of man look like? Well, I know for my own purposes, the anger of man is what? It's quick to speak.
Yeah.
It's quick to put ourselves above someone else. I think about what incites anger in my life. It's when I feel like my needs are being put back burner to somebody else's.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe if I perceive there's some selfishness there, well then my response is oftentimes selfishness in return.
Right.
How dare you have this selfish attitude towards me when you know that it's my need that needs to be met, or it's my idea that needs to be adhered to?
James sets it up perfect with 19. He sets 20 up perfect because what anger looks like is being slow to hear and quick to speak, right? And that's what makes you quick to anger. That's what pushes this idea, and really has nothing to do with the righteousness of God. Anger, obviously anger is something that happens as talked through Scripture. But the result of that anger is what matters, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what's constantly told to us, is how we handle that anger, what we do with that anger. And what James says is, if you feel yourself starting to get angry, what you probably need to do is not say anything and listen more, right? Because sometimes what that does is gives you further clarity on what's angering you. It can keep you from putting your foot in your mouth out of acting solely off of emotion. Because the emotion of anger is not one that correlates with the righteousness mm-hmm. of God. So, he tells you kind of from the beginning, hey, look, I know anger is going to come. Be slow to it. And the way you slowly get into anger is to listen longer and speak less.
Yep. I think about the way we teach our children. Yeah. Right? If our children become angry, we try to give them coping mechanisms. There's the counting method.
Yeah.
Right? I personally like the run as far as you can until you can't, you're out of breath.
Yeah.
We give them ways to try to diffuse that anger, to maybe not delay it, but to help with it not being so pent up.
Definitely.
Do we do that ourselves? I think about what I've told Henry when he gets frustrated. I'm like, well, son, let's be patient. Do we do that? Do we exercise self-control? Are we slow to respond? Right? Because like Jacob said, like James said, a lot of it is taking the time to listen.
Yeah.
To really hear what it is that's being said. Are we slow enough to respond, to not let our first response be the response? Because I think you all can relate to, at least most of you, some of you probably have amazing self-control and we can learn from you. Most of us understand scenarios where something gets said and we're right back with the response and it was the exact wrong response.
Right. We talked about last week, because James speaks on patience in the verses previous to this, how we're to be patient. You're kind of either patient or you're not. There's not a time where you can say, well, I'm only so patient, right? Because once the patience is gone, you're not patient anymore, mm-hmm. right? So understanding that and applying that to realize, hey, patience is really important if I'm going to have self-control in this environment.
Mm-hmm. And again, even from what we see James presenting, Jacob talked a minute ago about, it's not that we can't be angry. It's how that anger manifests itself.
Yeah.
It's not that we can't give someone some tough feedback. We can't challenge someone on something it is they're doing. We just must be careful to do it in a way that's constructive. Because he says there in verse 20, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Correction can achieve the righteousness of God, right? Helping encourage our brothers and sisters, you all helping encourage me, can achieve the righteousness of God if we approach it in a humble way, in a loving way. And so often when we feel wronged, humble and loving are not the first things that come out of our mouths.
Well, and that's why Paul tells to the church at Ephesus, fathers, do not provoke your children in anger, mm-hmm. right? Because the understanding is, if you react in anger, what James tells us, and pretty much what Paul is telling us there, is that separates you from the righteousness of God. Mm-hmm. That separates the position of you, that separates the circumstance from the righteousness of God.
Mm-hmm. So verse 21, James chapter 1, therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. If anyone thinks himself to be religious, and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. First, we'll set this aside. James, in the context of this discussion, brings up the tongue.
Yeah.
And in a lot of our anger conversation, a lot of it is our verbal response toward people. Now, as most of you are aware, because it's the go-to place, James chapter 3 is all about the tongue. And we're going to spend, I'd say, probably quite a bit of time on that in a couple of weeks. So we're not going to focus so much on verse 26, though it is important to what James just said. But let's note a couple of things that he points out. In talking about being a doer as opposed to being a hearer, right? Being active in your faith as opposed to being passive. Now, Jacob, you know me pretty well.
I do.
This idea presented here by James has been one that's always been difficult for me. Difficult in the sense that I tend to be an individual who will analyze and reanalyze and question. And unfortunately, what that sometimes leads to is inaction, because you sit on something so long, you analyze it out of fear of it failing, that you don't take any action at all.
Right. And that's one of the things, it's our negative reactions to anger that we're supposed to be slow to. Doing the will of God is what we're supposed to be quick to do, right? And that's kind of the difference in those two situations, that we often try to use the other one. See, I'm just being slow to it. Well, no, you're not supposed to be slow to that. You're not supposed to be slow in doing good. You're supposed to be slow in your negative reactions to things that are different from the righteousness of God.
Yep. How many of us have had this exact scenario? We see somebody in worship on Sunday morning and you think, I don't recognize that individual.
Yeah.
Maybe I should go over and talk to him.
Right.
Oh, but what if this person's been here for 10 years and I just don't know him?
Yeah.
Oh, see, now I might offend them because I haven't gone over and met him already, or maybe I have interacted with him and I don't remember him.
And to be honest, that is one of the most common things you hear in churches, is people scared to go introduce themselves because what if they've been here for 10 years and I've never met them? Well, then I would say it's time for you to meet them, right? But
because
that's not how we do.
What unfortunately so often happens, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm not pointing fingers here.
Definitely.
What so often happens is the moment passes, you leave the situation, the person's gone now, and now you haven't made that connection out of that fear of, well, I might look ridiculous because everyone knows this person but me.
Right.
So we have to ask ourselves in those moments, is it better to live out our faith by making that connection, even if we look foolish, right? You obviously don't remember the person, so there needs to be a reconnection made. Or is it better to not look foolish? And that's a very small example. It's much bigger than that in service to our neighbors and to our communities.
Yeah.
So often I struggle with putting myself out there for fear of it not working, falling apart, looking ridiculous in the process. And James here is saying, look, if you've heard the word, you've got to do the word.
Yeah.
There's really not this, well, I'm a Christian. And, we'll get in later to this show me your faith by your works conversation. There's not a lot to this whole idea of I'm a Christian in word only.
Right.
I believe in Christ, but James, of all the writers of the New Testament, James says, prove it.
Yeah.
Do it.
Definitely.
There's a couple of quotes. These are secular quotes that have stuck with me. One, and when I first heard this, because of the way I am, this really hit home with me. The quote is, learn who you are in practice, not in theory. And the idea that was being communicated by this quote was, really be honest with yourself in how it is that you operate. Because we can sit around and we can theorize all day about what we would like to do. Well, I recognize a need here. Maybe I could fill that need in this way. Maybe I could reach out to my neighbor like this. Maybe I could encourage my brother like this. But until we start removing the barrier of I'm afraid to act and we start doing, well, then that's all it is. It's theory.
Right.
And so this individual who I heard make this comment was saying, you need to learn who you are actually in practice. What is it that you do that you will actually take on and do? Don't just know yourself in theory, but know who you are in practice. And from that point, you can grow to where you want to be.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
So if there's something that, let's say that you're great about filling needs behind the scenes, needs that maybe don't get noticed by folks, or maybe you just need someone to say, hey, this needs to be done. And that's your catalyst to say, okay, I have permission now to do it, so I'm going to go do it. And maybe that's what you do best, and you're not so good at finding the needs, but once the need's been identified, you go fill it. Well, maybe knowing who you are in practice will lead to you saying, okay, who around me is really good at knowing about the needs that need to be done. Maybe I just need to hitch myself to them and say, okay, if you identify a need, let me know, and I'll be the one to go fulfill it. And you've helped to kind of cover up your deficiency by relying on somebody else. The same way, there are people in our congregation who are great about noticing who's new and who's not.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there's several.
I mean, the first couple that comes to my mind are John and Joyce Christopher.
Of course.
I can't tell you how many times I've had a hand placed on my back, and I look around, and it's John Christopher, which, by the way, next time you see him, call him Little Billy. He likes that. But it's Little Billy behind me saying, hey, that couple over there, they're new. You need to go talk to them.
Right.
And sometimes that's all I need, because I'm walking around doing my own thing in my own world. But all I need is somebody to say, hey,
yeah,
you might need to go meet this individual.
Go meet them, definitely.
And so knowing who we are in practice and finding ways to account for our deficiencies to help us to be better in the practice that we're good at can really help us as we pursue the life of being a doer, a doing Christian, not a Christian in name only. He also, of course, at the end, I said we were going to leave alone 26 for a while because we're going to spend a lot of time on the tongue, as is Steve on Wednesday nights. But verse 27, and I think a verse that we go to often just to hit this point in a concise way. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God our Father, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. We read this verse and we take a couple of things away. One, pure religion in God's sight is service, because taking care of orphans and widows is one of the purest forms of service, the form of serving people who cannot always serve themselves. Mm-hmm. And also, he adds to that, and keeping oneself unstained from the world. See, here in a minute, we're going to get into the discussion, or James gets into the discussion in just a minute, about faith and works. We'll actually visit that next week. And this idea of faith and works, and which one's weightier, and what do you have to have? Of course, it's a debate that's gone on in Christendom for forever.
Yeah.
James here, I think, is interesting. He's linking the works with taking care of orphans and widows, and he's also saying, keep yourself unspotted from the world. Continue to pursue the things that are righteous in the sight of God. And so often with James, I could talk about, I love him because he's so practical. It's not an either-or proposition. It's not a, you have faith in Jesus Christ, great, that's all you need. It's a, look, if you have faith, go prove it. But you know what? You also can't go live a life that the world would look at as being in line with what they think. Go serve, but also don't act like the world.
Yeah, and like you said, the simplicity behind that is pure and undefiled religion is action, right? He's just going on to further prove his point of religion is not just hearing this stuff and knowing it. It's actually producing and doing it. So many times religion gets put in a box of just worship on Sundays and all those things, and that's what they say religious people are, people who go to church. And actually that's usually backwards of what religious people actually are. And they, you hear the phrase that I'm not a big fan of, well, I'm not very religious, but I'm spiritual. Well, James says religious is not the idea of Christianity or God. It's the action of following them. Mm-hmm. So if you're saying you're not religious, that means that you're not willing to do the things that God has called you to do, to stay unstained, to take care, serve people the way that you're supposed to do. So our mindset has to be redone there. Because if that's what religion is now, that's not the religion that God put for us, right?
Which again, we're going to revisit this much more heavily in a few weeks when we get to, next week when we get to the end of James chapter 2.
Definitely.
Chapter 2, verse 1. My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes, and say, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or you sit down at my footstool, have you not made distinctions amongst yourselves, and become judges with evil motives. Listen, my brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and the heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into the court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called? We'll stop there for now. I love, not to belabor the point, but I love the practical life applications that James uses. Again, he's talking about people coming into an assembly, or even just specifically in an assembly, but even just associating with individuals. And he's saying if you recognize someone as being rich or of status, and you treat them special because of that, then you are deciding amongst yourselves who is more worthy of honor, which is counter to what God would have us to do. He said, didn't God choose the poor of the world to be the rich and honored in the kingdom? But I love the example that he uses. He says, isn't it the rich and those with high status who are dragging you into court over things? So why is it that you're paying homage to them when they come into your assembly and not to this lowly man over here who is really the one that needs all of the help?
We always have those preacher stories, and every time you bring that up, the preacher story you tell is the preacher who just got hired by a church, and 2 weeks before he's supposed to start, he dresses up like a homeless man, and goes in, and no one really says anything to him. Then he comes back as the new preacher in a suit and tie the next week, and everybody's all over him, and he can tell what kind of congregation he has by that. I don't know I'm sure that has happened in times past, but in honesty, I don't think that our minds go to this person is dressed nicer, this person has money, I'm going to go focus on them instead of the other person. I don't think that's where our mind really is, but I think why we have such a problem with this still is because we know that if we're going to make a connection with someone through Jesus, what Jesus taught us is you connect with that person with finding similarities between yourselves. That's how you keep humanity between you, is you find similarities. It's a lot easier for us to find similarities of what we want to be, right? And so many times, the people who have wealth and fame and all that's the kind of stuff we want. So it's easy for us to put ourselves over to that to find commonality with them in that. For someone else who is poor and maybe not as well, it's harder for us to humble ourselves enough to find what we have in common with this person. And I think that's what James is saying. Don't forget what brings you together. The commonality here is that you're both loved by Jesus, the one who saved you. Mm-hmm. And while some of these other people are blaspheming the name by the way they're living, the poor people, which God is giving his kingdom to, you have a lot in common with them as well.
Well, and Jacob, I'm happy you mentioned that, because I agree with Jacob that I don't think we see someone who is different from us and make a conscious decision to undervalue them.
Right.
I do think, for many of us, we live lives insulated from people who are not like us.
Right, yeah.
Now, this is not applying to everybody. I don't mean to make a generalization, but I think in the society in which we live, in the area in which we live, so often we don't interact with many people who do not fit our socioeconomic box.
Definitely.
And so it can become uncomfortable for us when we have an opportunity to interact with someone who is not like us, really in any way. Yeah. We don't know how to relate. We don't know what to say. It goes back to being a doer of the word instead of a hearer.
Yeah.
We scare ourselves. What's going to happen if I approach this individual? What's going to be the outcome if I start up a conversation? And we just don't do it. Now, I do think there's another side of this, less prevalent in the church, I would argue, but I think it does happen to us from time to time. Sometimes we may be tempted to pay more attention to someone who is seen as successful. And I don't just mean monetarily successful, but if they've been seen as successful in their career, successful in rearing their family, whatever that is, that we might associate more with those individuals out of the perception that they can do something for us.
Right.
So Luke chapter 14, Jesus makes this point, verse 12. And he also went on to say to the one who had invited him, When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite friends or brothers or relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And again, I don't mean to say that it's this conscious decision every time of, oh, I'm going to go associate with this individual because they can give me back what it is I'm giving them. Mm-hmm. But I do think Satan has a way of slipping that into our minds from time to time.
Definitely.
Looking for ways that, I can be nice to this individual, I can strike up a relationship, and maybe there'll be some benefit for me in return. And what Jesus is arguing there in Luke is your benefits from God.
Yeah.
In the resurrection. It's not even necessarily here on this earth. It's how you'll be blessed in the resurrection of the saints. And so there are several layers to this. We sometimes struggle, as did those James was writing to, with welcoming in people who are not like us.
Definitely.
Again, whether it's a conscious decision that we're making, whether we're scared to talk to somebody not like us, whether we think we might get something out of focusing on the individual who is of higher status.
You ready to pick up in verse 8?
Yep.
If, however, you are fulfilling the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law of transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Jacob and I were having a debate this morning, which happens a lot, by the way.
It does.
Ask Daniel and Sarah, they can tell you. We were having a debate this morning, and Jacob brought up the scripture referenced in James chapter 2, verse 8. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So much of what we're talking about is held in that. Right? In that very simple, straightforward statement. It addresses what James is talking about here. It addresses why do we treat people differently. If we love them as ourselves, that's not going to be a thing for us. It doesn't matter their social status, how much money they have, the color of their skin, where they're from. We'll treat them like we want to be treated, which is with love and respect and honor. And he ends this thought, he ties it up with the way that we extend judgment and mercy. And he says, look, the judgment that you've doled out will be doled out back to you if you have failed to show mercy in your life. We lead lives of relying on God and relying on God's mercy, and then sometimes we can't get over what in reality is a very minuscule thing, a transgression against us. We'll hold tight to that, and we'll say, how dare this person do that? And we'll have so much trouble getting over it. And we think about what it is that God has had to show us mercy for in our lives, and it really makes us seem, whiny and pathetic, really, the way we hang on to things.
When you can get through your head, and this is not saying that you can't make judgments about situations, but when you get through your head that God did not put the burden of being judged over another person on you, it makes it a lot easier to understand what mercy is. Because if you think that you have to be the righter of all the wrongs done against Jesus, you're never going to be able to look at people the way you need to look at them. If you're the one who is having to make that decision. That's why he continually tells us, look, this is not your place to do. God will take care of this. You err on the side of mercy because that's where you're going to be erred for when you do that. And sometimes that's so hard for us to get through our heads that if we're going to err, if we're going to do something that's lean one way or the other, we're constantly told, lean on the way of mercy because that's the same way that you're going to be judged. Now, that's not saying that you can just go out and just do whatever you want and God's going to come out and say, well, you can do whatever you want. It's saying you understand that God is going to judge that because He has an ability that I don't have. and he has an affinity for mercy that I don't have. And so if I can just get to the point where I begin looking at everyone, loving them as I love your neighbor as yourself, then it frees you so much to be someone who shares the gospel, because you're not trying to be the judgment of the gospel.
Right. Because we had the capability, thanks to the Word of God, to say, this thing is detestable to God.
Yeah.
But this person is a child of God,
Right.
and a child that deserves love and respect. And so if it's, because too often it's judgment without mercy.
Yes.
It's how dare they ought to be punished, and that's where we leave it.
And we can make judgments, like you said, on what is right and wrong. But once we start labeling people as their judgment instead of mercy, we're going to start being labeled as our judgment instead of the mercy that's been given to
As
us.
opposed to seeing them as that is someone who needs help, that is someone who needs love, someone who needs to be encouraged, who needs to know what it is that God says, and not just label them as, well, that person's too far gone to help.
Yes.
We're going to wrap it up. As we said, we feel like we've got a better handle on the division of James than
Yes.
those who divided James.
Very much so.
So next week, we're going to pick up, because there's a little bit of a pivot here to faith and works that we've alluded to. So we're going to spend a lot of time on faith and works, and also get into the tongue. So again, if you've not been following along with Steve's lessons on Wednesday nights, highly encourage you to do that.
Yeah.
They're very scriptural and also very appropriate for this day and age, right?
Yeah.
Where there's so much inflammatory rhetoric going around, and really challenging ourselves to think about what it is that we're going to say and how we present ourselves.
Definitely.
Remember also on Wednesday nights, following Steve's lesson, we have growth groups going on digitally through Zoom. If you're not a part of a group, please let me know. Contact one of your friends here at church. Say, hey, what group are you in? And let's get you in a group. I know for my purposes, the group I've been meeting with, we've had a lot of good discussion. Even outside of the lesson, had good talk about the needs we have in our lives and prayer requests. So we would encourage you to get involved in that.
Definitely. We are excited. Our college students are back. Today we have a lot going on with our college students. We'll have open house at the campus houses. That's 327 and 329 Augusta Avenue. If you want to come over there, meet our interns, see what the facility that we have. Maybe you're not real familiar with it. We want you to come over there. This is a ministry that RNC is strongly invested in, and we appreciate all of you, and really want you to be as involved in the ministry as you want to be. Also, tonight, our college students will be doing our PM worship service. So make sure you come out, get to know them a little better, support them, and also get to worship with each other again on a Sunday night, which we're excited for.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. We love you, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Love you guys.